Record. I like that in the years that Zoom has been evolving and learning, they've added that feature now where they announce that you're being recorded. So no one can sneak up on you. You should know your rights, digital rights. So great. Good morning and welcome to this presentation from TENS, the Episcopal Network for Stewardship. My name is Davey Gerhard and I'm the Canon for Stewardship for the Diocese of California, and I'm the Executive Director of TENS, the Episcopal Network for Stewardship. We are really pleased to have you all on a call today where we can talk a little bit about budgeting and finances from a ministry perspective. These aren't just financial documents, these are statements of our values. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and give you some tools about how you can frame this discussion in your congregation when it comes time to planning a budget. So we're going to go over a few things today. And we'll talk a little bit about the theology of church budgets. This is not a course that's taught in seminaries, but there is a theology behind how we construct a budget, and it says something about what we believe and who we are. We're going to talk a little bit about why church budgets include information or perhaps include goals and values that aren't about other organizations might not share. Yes, we all want to have a healthy balance sheet, but we also look at a lot of factors when it comes to what is success and what is profit. So let's talk about that in our church context. Equally important to setting and following a great budget is communicating about it. And the place where I see most congregations run into the most problems is when they don't report on things that are happening, even if they're good, even if nothing's wrong. The mere sign that people aren't reporting on it often cause alarm or cause people to ask questions or cast doubts. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how to report and what kinds of things you should report on throughout the year. And finally, we're going to end with a little conversation about narrative budgeting and how to construct those documents. I want to start, however, by taking us out of this slideshow and moving us into a little conversation with each other as we begin, kind of to get a little benchmark of where all of us are coming from. And the question I'm going to ask us and ask you to respond to in a second is, what process do you use in your congregation to create your budget? And when does that start? Does that happen earlier in the year? Does that happen in December? Do you present at an annual meeting? How do you create your budget and think about that? And then the second question I'm going to talk about is, well, what do we think a budget is supposed to do? What is the budget of a church? And why do we create them, and what's the purpose behind it? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. I'll remind us of those questions and pull us into this conversation so we can look at each other and spend a couple of minutes about this. So I'd love to hear from you all what your process is in your congregation for creating and setting a budget, how you do that, who's a part of that system, and when does it happen in your church calendar? Becky, looks like you, yeah.
I was trying to figure out how to show up since there's so few of us.
You showed up. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Our budgeting process is pretty well, we had some issues with COVID and everybody left who knew anything, so now we're trying to reinvent the wheel. We started working on it probably in the middle of December, which we usually would start working on it in November, probably after a stewardship campaign that we also forgot to have. So we're not right on top of things this year, but what we have done in the past is have pledges, and then we put those pledges in as this is income, and we think we're going to get this much in the plate and stuff. And one of the gentlemen who's new to our church pointed out that that would have I mean, you know, last year we thought our budget was going to be negative by about $30,000, which is not something you want to necessarily do, but I was on the council when we sweated, I mean, you know, blood to try to get the thing balanced, and you know, what it is what it is. We're cut to the bone. And so he suggested that since we didn't end up $30,000 short, but rather about $3,000 short, that we take into account what we thought was likely to be given as opposed to what was pledged. And so, you know, I'm kind of here to hear about that. I have
Great.
very little expertise in this, so it's helpful. I was a commercial lender, so I know what we're looking at, but I don't know how it applies to a church. So
That is really great. And you've said a lot in that about your practice and also about some of those assumptions you make. Definitely we'll be talking about that today. And I have some answers or some ideas about what you said, but I'd love to hear some other folks first, and then we'll kind of come back around to all that. Anybody else have a different experience in their congregation of how budgets are created and when you do it and who's a part of the process? Yeah, Karen.
Well, for us, and Joyce and I actually are at the same church, so but we generally start our process very much in the same way. In December, we usually present a preliminary budget in January to our vestry, and then we continue to refine it and then have a final budget that's approved by the vestry in February at their February meeting. Last year, we knew and approved a deficit budget, and this year we know we will have a deficit budget again. We would like not to, but the likelihood is going to be really maybe a miracle. And so what we're trying to do is come up to a strategic plan for how to work ourselves out of the deficit within a 3 to 5 year plan. We do have cash reserves, but we're tired of using them. So we're trying to figure it out. From 2019, we've continued to whittle down our expenses. And then we lost our associate. And by the time we replaced her, we only had half a year last year. But by the time we pull in the full year this year, we still end up with where our income increased. We've had the increased expenses as well. So I'm very interested in figuring out we've always done it based on pledges. And then we have like what we call our little fudge factor that we take out a certain percentage that will not be fulfilled pledges. And then we add in a little bit back for what we think is going to be plate offerings. But I'd be interested to see what you recommend for projecting extra.
That's a great question. Good. And that's a theme I hear emerging from this. Wonderful. Edna, come on off mute. There you go.
Hi, I'm from Connecticut, and we basically do the same process, except that I'm just the treasurer, and I just started because the treasurer resigned, so I'm new. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm trying really hard. I'm working with someone else who is a bookkeeper. So she recently turned to QuickBooks, so I'm learning that. But one problem that we have that I have not heard is that we are on the red. I mean, the church has gone through so many changes that we just inherit all this mess that they had. We do not have a cash reserve. So we are basically, it is a very poorly attended church. So we don't have a huge amount of money, in the plate when we collect. And we are basically functioning with the money that the ECCT allots to the church every year. This year, the bookkeeper requested a little raise, which thank the Lord we did get. So that's the only thing that we have functioning, and I'm just here to learn whatever I can learn, to see if there's anything that we can do to raise our funding so that we can work towards having a cash reserve for emergencies.
That's a great goal and really worthy. You know, one of the things that I've experienced in working with churches and even in my own congregation is that when we have really good accounting practices and when we can talk about them and share the numbers with people, talk about what's happening, it increases generosity, because the more people are aware of what we're facing, the more people can say, well, maybe I can do a little more, or maybe I could pitch in this way. We're not always very good in church about sharing our problems. The vestry tends to want to hide those or solve the problem on its own and then try to present something. But, you know, sometimes we have to say right up front, here's what we're facing, and we rely on the creativity and the wisdom of the folks in our congregation to help us begin to think, how do we get beyond this place? I'm glad that you're getting what it sounds like some mission subsidy from your diocese.
Yes.
It sounds like you're probably a vital and strategic ministry. The church is investing in you, and that should be really exciting to your members to say, look, we have a real reason for being here. The diocese wants us here. The church is trying to support us in this ministry. How do we begin taking this on ourselves and creating, weaning ourselves from that subsidy and also creating sustainability in our budget? I think this is a beautiful place. I know that maybe being treasurer wasn't your first dream, but I'm glad you're sitting in that chair now. Thank you for it, and it will be a beautiful year.
Thank you.
So who else has some ideas? And we're going to come back to all these points in a minute, but I'd love to hear from folks first before we start solutioning them. Yes.
So I can, go ahead.
I'm the senior warden at the same church as Karen, and this is the first time being a senior warden, but not my first time on vestry. But because of the deficit that we were facing, I actually had to stand up in front of our congregation and basically ask everybody to either increase their pledge or if they hadn't already pledged, to pledge. And we've gotten a decent response. To Karen's point earlier, that's not going to, we'll still have a deficit budget, but it won't be quite as large.
Good.
And quite honestly, we could be facing eliminating a position to get to a more comfortable place, or reducing hours of the people, one or two people that are full-time, not offering, even just a modest 3% rate. So we're having to look at some, harder things, because a $30,000 deficit for us would look awesome at this point.
Yeah, I hear that. Can I ask Joyce, so you said that asking for people to reconsider their pledges and maybe increase, you stood up and did that, and you got some results from that. That's great. I'm glad you got some results. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, knowing you had to do that and standing up and making that ask? How was it received? I mean, you got results from it, but how
Right.
psychically, how emotionally?
Well, yeah. So the final number's not in. They have till February 14th. We've had a long standing love grows here sort of motto, if you will. And so we obviously wove that into what better day to have your increase or your pledge in by Valentine's Day. Talked a little bit about, the isolation and loneliness that the pandemic has caused, and people got out of the habit of coming to church, things like that. But I was fortunate enough that we have enough other leadership that, and I work full time, and there are 2 or 3 other people who are retired who are working on what we call our annual giving campaign. And I said, I will get up there and do the speech. I need you to write it and then I will tweak it. And so that's what we did. It was on the long side, it was over 6 minutes,
Okay, that
but it
is a lot.
wasn't just give us money. It was a broader conversation.
Good.
It wasn't fun, obviously. And we acknowledged the fact that not everybody was going to be in a position to increase because
Sure,
of
yeah.
everything that's going on. But I got positive remarks, and even as I did this on January 29th, and just this past Wednesday, we have a community dinner, and I was at that, and I had at least one person come up to me and say, hey, you did a good job. We also held a financial forum after the service where Karen and I, mostly Karen, led kind of, here's where we're at. And
Okay.
we are getting ready to institute quarterly financial forums.
I love everything I'm hearing. Good.
The other piece that I'll just add into that is in that financial forum, we started out with where we were for pledging units and where we had been previous years. We went into the actual finances of what had been the actuals all for 2022, because our annual meeting is in November. So in November, even though we report, we're basically reporting generally through October or through the end of third quarter, depending on kind of when that November meeting hits. So, it was kind of important to then give them, yes, we did the second ask, but here's why we're doing it. Here's where our numbers have been as far as membership numbers, more pledging units than membership numbers, actually. And then here's where we are with those 2022 financials. Here's where we started with a potential 2023 budget and what that deficit looked like. And then we kind of closed up with one more time. Here's why we're asking. And we also want to start and do a better job of, because at the end there was a plug for our we call it Blessings, Gratitude, and Generosity Committee, and it's like a year-round stewardship committee. There was a plug for that, for people getting involved so we can start better programs in general on stewardship education. So
Fantastic. I love the name of your committee too. So, and that it's year round. You have some good practices. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about that. Barbara, you were going to say something about what happens in your congregation.
Yeah, so we're not so different from what I've been hearing. One thing, so we pledging, I think, in Canada, or at least in my church and maybe my diocese, is not as big as it is in the US, or from what I see coming from TEN. So we certainly do a stewardship campaign. We do ask for pledges. Probably 30% of our people pledge, but that doesn't mean only 30% give. There are others who just don't pledge. So we're working on language that is to get more people to pledge, to give us just a better picture. We do a lot of pre-authorized debit. So where pre-authorized people just give monthly through their bank accounts, which I'm sure you do as well. And so we take, if somebody doesn't pull out their money, we call that a pledge, even if they don't increase it. So that bumps up our numbers. But when it comes time to doing the budget, which happens now, we kind of, our budget process is mid-December to end of February, which is when our annual meeting is. We look at kind of where did the money come last year, and what of that money do we think is going to continue or come again? So we don't just look at what's pledged. We do take a much broader look at where our givings are coming from. And one of the things we benefited from a couple of bequests in 2022. And so we're having this conversation around, like, how do we budget for that? Because it does come into our operating budget. We also run a deficit. And so we're just trying to guess, like, who's old and who might have us in their will. I don't know. It's just not, there is no science to it, and it's a bit morbid, and but it's important. So I that's all I've got on that.
Barbara, we laugh about about planning for bequests and who's old. But it's actually not morbid. It's a beautiful conversation to have with people about end of life and assets and legacy and what they would like to do and how they would like to continue supporting the church. And I know that because I do a lot of planned giving in my role, it's difficult sometimes to imagine having that conversation about money and death. They're two really hard topics to talk about, right? But when we engage that faithfully, when we engage that question with people, and they really take it in, it begins to be a pastoral ministry conversation, right? It's not about shaking them out for their assets. It's about what legacy do you want to leave, and how do you want to support this church, or what do you want to tell your kids or your family or your community about what this place has meant to you. So I know that we often think these are morbid conversations or frightening, but they're beautiful when we have them the right way. Now, planning for a bequest is hard to do because they don't come in. We can't predict yet, and maybe we never want to, how those will come in. But I think that one thing your vestry might consider, and TENS we have a free one on our in our resource library, having a gift acceptance policy. So when a gift comes in, what does your vestry do with it? Does it put a bequest into the operating fund? Does it go into a reserve or an endowment fund? Do you make a decision about what you'll spend and what you'll save? And how does that happen? Sometimes just knowing that you have a policy, also it gives transparency to what we do with bequests, right? One of the problems that I've seen, and it's a problem in quotes, a large bequest comes to a church and then people say, well, I don't have to give much this year because I know we just got $250,000 from whatever, right? And that's so wrong. That's not the way it works. A bequest is meant to do something amazing for a congregation, not just to pay the regular bills, right? It's coming in, it's somebody's legacy. We want to do something that matters with that, even if that's propping up a budget that really needs some support, and we put some of it into this year's or next year's operating budget, or have a plan for spending it down while we increase our sustainability. Things like that. Bequests are really good when they have a plan. And having at least a gift acceptance policy that your vestry has talked about, your council has talked about and approved, put in place, then gives people a roadmap for when those gifts come. But it's hard to put them into a budgeting process, and it's hard to rely on them, I think, because when they come, they come. Becky, it sounds like you have something to say about that.
I have a couple of questions, actually, just in case we're going to address this sort of thing. But we had some money come in a few years ago, and it was invested in a stock fund. And then they called it an endowment fund. And so it's like, well, we're allowed to use the interest, except there isn't any interest because it's in a stock fund.
Right.
I also want to know the name of the stewardship committee that Karen and Joyce talked about, because you said you liked it, and it was like, I think I didn't write it down.
Yeah, can you tell us the name of the committee?
So, yeah, it's we call it BGG for short, Blessings, Gratitude, and Generosity. And that focus is more about stewardship education. We flip over in the fall to the annual giving campaign, and we're actually trying to separate the two, and maybe even have different people. So the stewardship campaign is, or the BGG is different than the annual giving campaign. But what we've been doing for, I don't know, the last 3 years, Karen, at least, is telling our story. So if you're on the vestry, you get to pick a month and a Sunday in that month and get up and tell your spiritual journey story, essentially.
And that's
Not
on the
more than 3
BGG.
minutes. And so that's sort of the BGG piece. And it is not just vestry. So like I've done it once because this is my second year in vestry. So I'm going to tag somebody else in the congregation to give their BGG. And it doesn't happen every Sunday, but we have somebody once or twice in a month might be giving their story. It's just that if you're on vestry, you're gonna sign up to do it.
That the vestry speak all year long, but during our annual giving campaign, we do have somebody speak every week.
Yep.
Just during that campaign period. And then generally what we try to do is pick, or I actually scheduled the speakers for the last 2 years. So what I tried to do was pick intergenerationally. We try to have somebody older, somebody younger. We tried to show as much diversity as possible for what's in our congregation. And there we give them the topic of whatever our annual giving campaign theme is for that year. And as Joyce said, Love Grows Here has kind of been sort of continuing for several years, but each year it's been a little different. And so they try to speak on what the church means to them and why they feel like they are involved, whether it's their time, their talent, or their treasures. And hopefully they're going to discuss all three.
Great.
So
Good. Becky, to address your first question, so there are 3 levels of reserve money, right? 2 of them are controlled by a simple vestry vote. That would be your reserve account. So like maybe you have a savings account or a money market or something like that you put, here's a reserve account. We put our savings into this. That's immediately controlled by the vestry and the treasurer. You can put money in and out of it easily. Then you have something that's one step more formal. That's called a fund functioning as endowment. So that means so you can still, from a vestry decision, pull money in and out of it, but you're treating it as money that you don't touch, and you set a percentage that you will take from it every year. So that could be 4% is what a lot of places are doing right now, because the market has been what it is. A few years ago, it was 5.5%. We're down to about 4 or 4.25% now. So often a fund functioning as endowment will put the money there. Everybody agrees not to touch it, and they agree on a percentage that can come into the budget from that amount every year. And that's calculated. And the most formal is to actually say this is endowment. So we're taking it, usually when we get securities, we sell them, and then we put them into the endowment. My own church invests directly in the endowment that the whole Episcopal Church uses. And then we pull out from that, or we get a draw from that in proportion to what we put into it. And certainly you can do that. Episcopal Church Foundation has a wealth of resources. ecf.org has a great amount of resources for you to figure out which of those 3 your vestry might want to think about. Is this a reserve? Is this a fund functioning as an endowment? Is this an endowment? And then your diocese, the Episcopal Church, or your local charitable bank or investment bank. Schwab, of course, does these. Other big banks do them, but your local community organization might have an endowment kind of program too. If you have a community foundation or a county credit union or something like that, they might be able to help you if you want to keep it very local. So
yeah, we have ours, or that stock business is with the Episcopal Foundation, I think.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah, so that's nice. I don't think anybody got to the point. We had a big upset just about as that was all happening, and so I don't think we got to the point of formalizing how much we can take out, given that it's not interest, it's, stock goes up and stock goes down, And then, oh, is it acceptable? And I kind of headed this out, the savings account. Somebody proposed that we have a vestry vote, a council vote, because we're Methodist and Episcopal.
Okay.
So that the council would vote if we needed money out of the savings account. And I resisted that strongly as the treasurer, because a couple of times a year, like the women's sewing group does a sale. And last year we were able to give $5,000 to different organizations in the community. But when that payout happens, I need not to be overdrawn. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
said, no,
Yeah.
we're not going to have overdraft charges and a bad reputation just because we can't get a quorum,
That's a great question. And often what vestries can do is set a limit. So the treasurer can move $10,000 from savings into checking without a vestry approval, or whatever your threshold is, $20,000 or whatever it is. And then if you need to go over that, okay, well, now we have to schedule a conversation because it's something serious or unexpected or whatever. But that you get a threshold amount approved for which you don't need permission. All you need is good reporting and accountability to show that that happened. And so that's one way, because it's terrible to tie your hands on something that needs immediate action and a check that needs to be paid. So getting, again, like a gift acceptance policy, if you have a policy on how much you're going to take from your investments, and if you have a policy on a threshold for what you can take out of savings, these things give you freedom in a way to be able to make moment-to-moment decisions that are important within a general oversight that still feels safe for everyone and doesn't get anyone into trouble. So consider that, and I think that's a very respectable way that a lot of vestries deal with it. I want to get us into some of our material where we're going to answer a lot of the questions you've talked about. So I'm going to start sharing slides in a little bit again. But I also want to apologize to Barbara for US tax law conversation. Sorry about that. Completely irrelevant to you. But I do want to go back to a point you made about pledging versus plate versus people who just give. And you said something like, what we would like to get people to pledge more. And I agree. I mean, it certainly is nice when people tell you what they're going to do. And even 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, really push for that. And the more our church accepts and moves towards a younger generation, we have to understand that savvy Gen Xers and millennials, and definitely the Gen Zers in your congregation, they might not ever fill out pledge paperwork. They're just not, that's not what they do. Will they put in their debit card and click auto renew? Absolutely. And they will consider that a pledge. And it makes it more difficult for congregations to know what to expect. But in my own congregation this year, we had a number of people who are using various platforms to do recurring giving. And if they didn't fill out any pledge paperwork, and after several messages asking them to fill out pledge paperwork, they still hadn't submitted it, we just waited for January to come around. And if those gifts continued to renew, we were like, great, they've pledged. And we threw it into the pledge column, and we're expecting that. Now we followed up with them and said, we noticed that you're renewing, and we're really grateful that you're renewing again this year. Thank you. Let us know if you're not. So that, we could make some expectation. And actually all of them said, oh yeah, of course. That's why I didn't contact you, because it's all done, right? So we have to, as a church, meet our donors where they are at. This is called donor-centric philanthropy. Nonprofits have been doing it for a couple of decades now, getting really good at how do your members want to make their gifts to you, and giving them all those options. Makes it a little more frustrated, puts more gray hair into our treasurers, but it also helps us understand that people give in different ways, and it's our role as church to say thank you and build our budgets off of what we know, and patterns we can deduce after time, right? There are also people, we have several of them in my own congregation, who don't do recurring giving because they don't like credit cards. They don't fill out pledge paperwork because they don't want to be indebted to anyone, but they put something in the plate and it amounts to about this much every year. And so we just say, okay, I know that Susan is going to give about this much this year, and we'll put that into her column. And if she surprises us in some way, then we'll deal with that. But you know, looking for those patterns and just saying, this is how we can build a budget off patterns is as helpful often as pledge paperwork. And we got to get used to it in the church. People are going to fill out fewer and fewer pledge forms as our younger generations become more and more dominant in our member structures. All right, there are a lot of unanswered questions which are going to be answered in slides in a minute, so I'm going to get into them, and we're going to come back at the end and have plenty of time left for questions and conversations. So let me share my screen again with you. All right. Let's talk a little bit about setting a budget. So now we've moved from how do we set budgets into some things that make for good budgets. Before the pandemic, the Alban Institute created sort of some ratios to think about. Now, these are guideposts in a church budget that you should look for, and don't try to make them all add up to 100 because they're ratios and they're ranges. But we're thinking about here, what's of value to the church? And so you want to make certain that your mission giving has an actual place in your budget. Now, this first line is controversial, I think. A lot of congregations create their budget based on their fixed expenses, salaries, utilities, building, program, and then like any outreach that they might want to do, they might think of differently. Maybe they raise that money differently, or it comes from a different fund. But the Alban Institute, and it would be my recommendation as well, that we put all of our giving, all of our mission-based funding and expenses and income into our budget, and so that we can account for it, so we can expect it, so that it mirrors our values. Obviously, a big chunk of our budget is about the programs that we administer. So the children's program, the music program, the programs that are established ministries within your congregation, those get a very healthy ratio of your budget and should be accounted for that. We all know that the largest part of every church budget is its payroll and benefits. That's where we spend the most money often. And so we need to account for that, but it can't take over completely, right? If we're only paying salary and nothing is left over for mission or program, then we're out of whack somewhere. Either we're not raising enough or we're paying too much, and that's an irrational thing to say, because how can you pay our clergy too much? But if things are out of balance, if they get over 60%, more than 2/3 of your budget, you're really starting to wonder, like, what are we able to do if all we're doing is paying salaries? And then, of course, you know, we have our buildings, and we have servicing of our buildings and maintaining them. And our buildings are old, and they're getting older every year. And the infrastructure, you know, it starts to need to be replaced. And so if we don't have maintenance reserves, and we don't have, we're not doing a reserve study so that we know how much we're supposed to put into our property every year so that we can, anticipate when the furnace is going to break or when the roof is finally going to give out or whatever it is. We need to account for that in some way. So what this is to say is that when you look at your budget, you should have some expected ratios, some places that you know you're on balance or out of balance. None of these should be zero. None of these should tend toward more than 60%, which is the very highest. And your program expense really needs to be present in your budget and accounted for. Why am I harping on this? Because I think often we forget that those programs, if we don't include them in our budget, they become easy to overlook. We don't want to forget about them. We want to be able to fund them, and we want to be able to report on how we funded them. And then later, we're going to report on how they impact us and our community. So this is just some guideposts. Yeah, Barbara, you've got your hand up.
Just a quick question. Those guideposts don't include administration. So does administration fall just under church ministry, or do we allocate it across all of
Yeah, I
those?
put it into church ministry. So
Right.
that's like your basic expenses of also insurance and utilities, and your parish administrator and your mailings, your things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, good question. Thank you for it. So your passion and your mission, they need to be represented in your budget. And beyond the numbers, budget should tell stories. They should tell the story of a place and what's important to us. So what is the mission of your church? Who is it serving? Who's in your community? Are those people and those needs reflected in your budget? You should base it, we talked about this earlier, on your projected income. Don't just take last year's income and add to it. Really do an analysis. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this in a minute, but really do an analysis of how your money's coming in so that you can set a goal that makes sense. Your budget is a spending plan, of course. We know that that's ultimately what it is. They're the guideposts of what we expect to spend. And if we go over in an area, we know what to do about that. It needs to cut somewhere else, or we need to dip into something to pay for that. But it helps us know where we're on track and where we're not. It's absolutely important that everyone agrees to the plan. That isn't the same as everybody's goals or dreams are met in a budget. Not everybody's favorite priorities can get met into a budget, but that when it gets approved, when it goes through its process, it has the legitimacy and the buy-in of your vestry or council, of your finance committee, of your clergy, and also of your stewardship or your blessing, gratitude, and generosity folks who are tasked with talking about what we raise and what we do with it throughout the year. So alignment is another way of saying this. If somebody grumbles after the budget has been adopted and says, well, they really didn't fund this and I wanted them to, and they were a part of the decision-making process, we should have a conversation with them. This is our budget. We need to support this budget. We agreed to it. We signed off on it. We're bought into it. You're a part of our leadership. Let's help you. Next year you can bring this back up and try and convince us or help the church understand what needs to happen. But just grumbling about something that doesn't get funded is really detrimental when it happens in leadership. So alignment is really important. And finally, it's communicated clearly at your annual meeting, posted on the bulletin board, I love it when congregations post it on their website. Here's our budget this year. You can take a look at it. And certainly, we're going to talk later in this conversation about throughout the year how you report on the budget and communicate what's happening in it. I want to go over a couple of concepts of how to adopt and draft budgets that maybe you're familiar with and maybe you're not. One of them is called the zero-based budget. And this is one that my diocese uses. Our CFO starts every year, or every program year, I should say, with zero income, zero expenses, and we build the budget from scratch. What we don't do is say, here's last year's budget, and we bring over all these numbers and say plus or minus, right? We start over again. She goes to each department head. What do you want to see in your ministry? How much is it going to cost? What are we going to do with it? She builds the dream, and then she chips away at our dreams. But what happens is that it starts from scratch. It doesn't assume that last year's budget was great and that this year should be the same. It might be the same when we end up, because program is program and funding is funding, and it might look very much the same, but the process we've gone through to arrive at it is one that is about collaboration and conversation and dialogue. And that's a really beautiful way to build a budget. It also says that we don't have deficit budgets or surpluses in our budget. What we do is we balance to zero at the end, and when throughout the year things change, we bring money in, either through reserve or through other extra income streams or whatever, to fund the programs. We don't get surprised at the end of the year by a surplus. We plan for that surplus. We're going to have $20,000 left this year, and it's not going to say 20,000 at the bottom. It's going to say we're going to fund our investments by $20,000 more this year, so that we build it into the process. Zero-based budgeting is a little wonky because it doesn't look like the budget that we're used to, but over time, with a lot of communication, it can be really helpful for a congregation to take this approach. Start from scratch, build it together. There's a whole lot of articles out there about zero-based budgeting. Some Fortune 500 corporations use it. Some congregations and dioceses use it. Other people say it's way too much work, and it is. It's a lot more work, but it has some benefits. I want to talk a little bit about faith-based budgeting. There's a trend in some congregations to not create much of a budget at all, but to say the money will come and we expect it. It's always happened. We'll fund the budget. It's going to be okay. We believe in it. We believe in our people. We believe in the power of God working through us. And so, we obviously know that we have to spend this much on program and salary and keeping our neighbors fed and visited and clothed. We need to do that work. And so we build those expenses in, but how the money's going to come in, it's based on faith. Now, I don't recommend this as a strategy. I want to bring it up because it sounds really beautiful and theological when you explain it, because who wouldn't want to give everything over to the Holy Spirit and say it's all going to be fine? But it doesn't give us the opportunity to have an honest conversation about expectations, about how my gift may be able to make an impact on the budget, or how my other gifts of talent and time might be used in the congregation to make our whole program run. So faith-based budgeting is a trend in some places. I just want to, and those congregations don't close at the end of the year, right? They do make it work. They've made it work for a while. So there's something in it, the Holy Spirit, we should count her in. She knows what she's doing. But sometimes I think this is a really hard one. And so I ask people to really look at it. You should develop your expenses and your income intentionally. A number of you, as we were talking about your experiences building your budget, we're going to go over a couple of slides now on some challenges that we're facing. And one of them is, how do we talk about money or budget building when there's ongoing pandemic related stuff or new created inflation problems in our unemployment or other crises in our community that are impacting people's ability to be generous. And so a first thing to say here is that when we're constructing our campaigns, we're constructing our budget, there's no shame in pledging less this year than you did last year. We need to make that front and center in our conversation with our parishioners. We hope you'll make your best gift, whatever that prayerfully considered best gift is. And you shouldn't do something that you can't make, something that is unsustainable for you. That seems like a logical thing to say, but people give sometimes out of guilt or other motives, and we don't want to encourage that behavior. We want them to make a gift that feels good to them. So there's no shame. The other thing to remember is that every conversation about money is a pastoral one. It's because we put way more than our checkbook on the line when we talk about money. We talk about our success and failure. We talk about our dreams and goals and our missed opportunities. We talk about our plans for our family and our health concerns and the very many things that our money impacts and is influenced by. So when we're having a conversation with each other about pledges, there often is something going on in the background. Whether it's articulated or not, there's something happening there. So approach conversation about money from a pastoral sensitivity, from an open heart. This is something important that we're sharing with each other. I often like to, before a stewardship committee goes out and does its work of asking people to participate, I like to run the list by the clergy. They might know things about people that the stewardship committee isn't privy to and doesn't need to know the details of, but they might know, let's not ask this family this year, or let's ask this family but not expect so much from them, or actually there's something really good going on in this household. Yeah, I have that conversation. It's going to be great. Clergy know, and we want them to be able to know about that. And so I often put you don't need to, if you're in one of those congregations that doesn't let the clergy know what people give, I have opinions about that. But I will say, as if that's your practice, you don't have to show the number. You can just say, here, I'm going to approach Davey for his gift. Is there any reason I shouldn't? Or is there anything going on? And trust that they'll tell you. And we expect that that's a good process. That's, again, going back to the fact that every conversation is a pastoral one. When we come up with moments of anxiety, let's remember that we've been through rough times. We remember we might still be digging out of the Great Recession from the aughts. And we might remember that. We got through it. We rebuilt. And we'll get through what we're experiencing now as well. So it's not the sky is falling. This is a moment in time. Let's remember that churches operate on longer timelines. A number of you talked about the fact that you're facing some cuts in your budget this year. And this is another time to be frank with your congregation, let them know what's going on. So how do you raise money when there are programs that are being cut or staff positions which are about beloved people, and people might say, why would you want me to give? You're eliminating Sally's position, and I love Sally, and I can't imagine you would do such a cruel thing. How do we have that conversation in the midst of cutting programs that might need to be adjusted? So the first is that we need to remember to focus on the mission. Always go back to what is the core of our church. How will we serve our neighbors? How will we serve the people in our congregation that need our love and our pastoral care? So some of that might be we need to stop spending money on some programs and do more volunteering, roll up our sleeves. How can we get some of these ministries done with the people and the time that we have to share? Some of it might be that we just have to say, yeah, but we're cutting this so that we can keep doing this, and have that forward thinking conversation about mission. Doesn't mean that it's less painful. It means that it is important to have. If you've applied for help and subsidy or assessment relief, or if you've gone outside your diocese to ask for funds from community support organizations, or you're digging into other revenue streams, remember that reporting on that is really important. If you just say, we have less money than we had last year and we don't have any plans to do anything about that, that sends a message to your folks. But if you say, we're facing some cuts, and before we make them, we want to make sure every stone is turned, and we want to look at every kind of program we can to alleviate this. We want to go to other organizations that might be able to help us, give us grants, give us support. It shows good financial stewardship on your part if you can show we're doing all that we can. And finally, every rector and perhaps every stewardship committee has a list of folks that they know can make an extraordinary gift. Maybe they're being saved for some future capital campaign or some big expenditure that's coming down the road. This might be the time. This might be the time to ask someone to make a generous gift to the church, because now is when the need is being felt, not later. We might still come back to you when we need to replace the furnace, but if you can make a gift now, could you do it? And so sometimes, not saving that rainy day fund, maybe this is the rainy day. We need to understand and evaluate that. Is this the time when we dig into it? A number of you said we're using our reserves now and we have a plan to get out of that, which is a great way to address this. So we're not gonna stop doing program. We're not going to cut yet. What we are going to do is borrow from our future and know that we have to pay ourselves back from that reserve fund and wean ourselves from that. And here's the plan. I think one of you said you have a 3 to 5 year plan to get yourself off the reserve and back into a place of sustainability. Talking about that, we have reserve, we're okay right now, we're in good shape, and we have a plan so that this isn't our permanent state. We just don't dwindle our reserves and then are left with nothing. We have a plan to build ourselves out of this. That is a really important thing to tell your congregation about, because it shows them that you are in control, that you're taking responsibility for this. Finally, it's uncertain, right? Everything is uncertain right now. We've been through it. We have been through it in the last few years. Changing landscapes, changing politics, changing viruses, changing economics. And so things feel uncertain. How do we talk about raising money and creating budgets when we might not know what December of next year is going to look like, because the world seems to change really quickly right now? I think this is where, having 2,000 years of experience as an institution, the church can say something about the fact that we've always come through times of uncertainty. We will continue to exist. We will be okay. That is the essence of the Christian hope. That is what we preach and we proclaim. We proclaim this steadiness because we know we are right with our mission. So remember that when we're in these scary and uncertain moments. And also know that we can make changes. So people can change their pledge up or down as their year looks better or worse. We should make that easy and transparent. What you pledged back in November, come June, you might be in a different place. If you can increase your giving, there's no reason to wait for the next stewardship campaign to do so. We should make it available to people. You can always change this with a conversation. Incidentally, if you lose your position or if something changes, it shouldn't be a shame to go to your treasurer or to your rector and say, I can't make this year's gift in the way I plan to, and I'd like to change it this way. And just have that honest conversation rather than feeling bad about it or rather than walking away from giving altogether. Make it possible for people to have conversations so that they can make the honorable gift. A hallmark of transparent and accountable leadership is the frequent reporting of your budget. So I want to shift a little from how do we create budgets to how do we report on them. And that was something that many of you mentioned as we were talking about our challenges and our experiences of budgets. Numbers are an indicator, but they don't always tell us the whole story. We need to report on our money to our members and teach with that. They teach about our expected revenue. So we're relying on your gifts. We're relying on your time and your talent as well to keep the things running in our congregation. And they're a small window. And I say they're just a window into the capacity because, our pledges are only this much of what we give to church. We give so much more. I recently heard the newly retired bishop from Olympia, Greg Rickel, speak about stewardship. And he was addressing the tithe, the question of the tithe that people always have. Should I be giving 10%? Should I be giving 10%? Is that net or gross? These conversations that Episcopalians often get in. And he said, forget about the tithe. Christians give 100%. We are all in to the mission of the church. So everything that you're doing should be aligned. The way you raise your family, the way you make your money, the way you contribute to your community, the way you give to your church, the witness you bring to your life by being good Christian people, we're all in. And that's 100% of our time, talent, and treasure is being devoted to the cause of being good people and changing the world as Jesus told us to do. So forget about these percentages and these amounts that we give. We give everything because that's what was shown to us. We've received from an extravagant God who gave everything and are led by a prophet and a king who gave everything. We also give it all. And that's not saying empty your bank account and walk away from your life. It's saying everything that we do is aligned in the mission of who we are as people. Remember that and teach that. That is a great line for your Blessing, Generosity, and Gratitude Committee. We've received such gratitude. We give such blessing because we are generous people. We create that cycle of generosity. Look at your pledges and look at them over time. I think often when we say, what should our goals be this year? We look at last year's giving. We fail sometimes to look at trends. Now I realize that trends from 2020 to 2022 are hard to analyze because what a world we lived in. But if you're in that place where there is some trend to look at, really pay attention to 3 years or 5 years of pledge history. Are things going up or down? Are they staying steady? We know that incomes aren't staying steady. People are getting raises, but their cost of living is going up. Are our pledges changing with the market? I hate to be so capitalist in saying that, but are we adjusting our pledges, or are we just giving last year's gift over and over again? TENS has a webinar which you can download from our page called Breaking Through the Pledge Plateau. I think it's a great one to really talk about how do we help our members look at what they're giving and be blessed by what they see around them. Sorry, that aforementioned siren going by my window. So be aware and help people make those gifts, make their best gift by analyzing and knowing your trend. I think it's really important to talk about impact as well. I've seen congregations do this really well, where they put it right in their weekly bulletin. This is our budget year to date. This is our pledge year to date. This is our, this is where we're at. Here's a snapshot. Maybe it's a month number, or maybe, you're accurate enough that you can get it up to that week or whatever your most recent numbers are. Putting it right in the bulletin, or putting it in your newsletter, or broadcasting it in some way so that people can see, here's where we're at. They have a snapshot of it. But beyond where we're at, here's also the impact. So at the beginning of the year, at our annual meeting, we talked about our food program, our tutoring program, our daycare program, our outreach to refugees, whatever we're doing, all the things we're doing. Report on those numbers too. We said we were going to feed 1,000 families this year. It's June and we're at 690. That's great. Keep going. We can blow past that number. Or how are we doing on measuring our impact? Impact is, it helps our members understand the generosity that they have and the way that changes the world around them. This is really important. The church does not do a good job of talking about its impact in the community. Sometimes we talk about how fun it was to do the food program together or things like that, but we don't always say, and we fed this many people. This many people rely on us week to week, or whatever it is that we want to talk about. Bring those metrics into your reporting beyond the numbers. The budget numbers, very important. How those budget numbers change the world, even more important. Talk about that too. And it always then ties our money to our mission. We want people to feel always connected when they make that gift, that you're funding mission. You're not funding utilities, you're funding mission. All of it is mission. When you have things that are experiencing trouble, we haven't been able to hire that youth person because the job market's really tight, or things are really crazy right now, or it's been really hard to recruit volunteers for our Saturday morning program. We're thinking of moving it to Thursday nights because, Saturday mornings are hard in our community. Talk about what you're doing when programs start to feel like they're falling apart. How are you addressing that? This is because it helps people remember that their money is going toward things that they're supporting in the world. And we as a church are paying attention, not just to your giving and our expenses, but also to the promises we made and the pledge we made to our community. I love doing a mid-year report. If it's the only time that you send out pledge statements, it's really important to meet the budget with the pledge statements and say, here's where we're at. So if it doesn't happen weekly in a bulletin or monthly in a newsletter or whatever, make sure at least at one point in your year, you're reporting back to your members about what happens. And in that summer slump that we get when we're reliant on plate and pledge coming in through checks or cash, push some of those other ways, promote online giving or bank checks or other ways that people can make their gifts so that that summer slump doesn't happen when people take their long vacations or when they leave to go do other things, or it becomes difficult to balance Sunday morning with other things that their families are doing. Remember to report on the mission. Give testimonials, videos. You talked about in your Blessing, Gratitude, and Generosity Committee about how people report on what's happening. Bring some of those program minutes into it as well. People who are either benefiting from the programs, if it's appropriate to tell those stories, or people who are running or volunteering those programs, bring them in. Talk about what it's like. Maybe there are people in your church who never make it to that Saturday food pantry because they have something else that's going on. We'll bring them into it by storytelling. Report on the programs that your congregation is funding. How many people are participating in your church? This goes beyond our average Sunday attendance, and it goes into how many people do we interact with each week through our programs, through people who are coming in to use the building for other purposes. What is our church here for? A few years ago, an organization called Partners for Sacred Places did a study called the Economic Halo Effect. And they figured out that every temple, mosque, and church within the United States was contributing an average of $1.1 million of service to its community annually, just by being there, by being open, by being a part of the community. And that's an average number across all religions. And it takes into account the tiniest place and the largest place. It's an average number, which is an imperfect measure, but it gives us an idea that your church, just by being there, is doing something. It's making a statement. It's making your community safer, better. People are receiving value from it. The services that you offer, maybe just the community space you provide, whatever it is, your church is doing something by being open. So investing in the church is a really important thing to do because it's changing the world. And that's why we're in this business. It's also really, really important to remember the people. So we've talked about the numbers, we've talked about the mission. Let's also remind our members that they too are important. How many of them are volunteering? Tell some stories of our programs and the way they interact with volunteers. Get those volunteers up at the chancel and reward them with compliments, shower them with joy, tell them how grateful you are for their ministry. Report on stories. They tell great stories. So invite them to talk about why they volunteer. And also in your newsletter, present opportunities for people to volunteer their time, whether it's with your church in something that you're doing or with other agencies in your neighborhood. This is a really powerful thing. We have to remember that we're not the only people providing human services to our communities, that there are nonprofits, that there are other churches, that there are schools that are doing really important work in the world. And so if you know that there's an agency that is recruiting volunteers to run a program, ask them, can we put your website into our bulletin? How many volunteers? What's the requirement? Can we advertise volunteer opportunities? This helps your members just be more a part of the community. Whether they're volunteering in your church or other community events, they're being more capacious, generous, loving people. And that's infectious. Infectious is the wrong word to use in a pandemic, but that is a beautiful thing that we can then give each other. when we remind people of the ways they can volunteer. I want to end, and then I want to give us time for questions with a little plug for narrative budgets. So we talked earlier about zero-based budgeting and other things, and this is yet another beautiful headache for treasurers to see if you can imagine a world in which you put together a budget that is that tells the story of your mission. A narrative budget isn't a line item budget at all. It's stories. It talks about your mission as programs with income and expenses in each line item. And so you might say, our children, youth, and family ministry takes this much money from our program and this much time from our rector and this much time from our associate, and you add up all of those things and you give your children, youth, and family ministry a bottom line. What does it cost to run this ministry? What does it cost in its building usage, in its percentage of the utilities it uses? Now you're taking those line items in your budget and you're reorganizing them into things that impact our mission. You're telling the story. So at the end of the day, it costs us this much money to run programs in our church. TENS has a whole thing from in our resource library. You can download a sample narrative budget and a tool that helps you turn that line item budget into a narrative budget and tell those stories. So it sort of looks like this at the end of the day. This particular church, how does it fund its budget? So you have a pie chart there of where all the money comes from and how they get allocated. It's nice and transparent. And then you have, how do we allocate our budget? So you notice we're not talking about insurance administration and salaries, but we're talking about our program areas. We're talking about our ministry, because all of those fixed costs, those salaries and everything, are built into what it costs to run our program. And so these numbers, they add up to each other. They make sense to each other. And this is one way of constructing a budget that people can take a look at and understand that it's more than line items. Of course, you need to present a line item budget as well. But this is a way of describing your mission in a storytelling way. Some of us are visual learners, some of us like stories, some of us like numbers. The more, the better. Finally, I want to talk about, what can you do mid-year to make your budget, make it transparent? If you do a mid-year review, maybe around a mid-year event like your church picnic or your street fair or whatever you do in the summer with your families and kids, do a little report on all the things that we talked about at our annual meeting and where things stand. I want to end with this year's TENS resources, which are right now in a room right next to mine, being uploaded to the website by my partner, who's also our web developer. So this year, our theme is Rooted in Abundance, and it takes a look at the idea that we all are rooted in values that are about our generosity and recognizing the generosity that has come from creation and comes from our communities. So this year, that's our theme. All of our stuff is going to be tied to that, and we're creating and uploading that program as we speak. So it's going to be a beautiful year together, rooted in abundance. That's the end of my slideshow, and now we've got a little time for questions, and I see we already have one from Barbara.
This is just a quick question. Are you able to share the password for this year's resources?
I am, and it might be already the new one because it was being changed as we were on this call, I think. So it is Jeremiah 17:8.
Okay, thank you.
No spaces in that. That's going to go out on Monday to all of our diocesan partners. And then we'll start to share that password, but you have it first.
Excellent.
Now, if it doesn't work
Thank you.
yet, it's because Simon hasn't clicked the button. But it will work by the end of the day. It's happening right now, so it's very exciting.
Can you email your presentation to us?
Absolutely. I'm gonna send you the slide deck, the video, and the password so that you have it. That's gonna go
Wonderful.
out probably later today. What other questions or experiences do you have in the time that we have left? Yeah, Becky.
I have a question about the part of the concept of the zero-based budget. Most of us are not working with the luxury of saying these are the programs we're going to have, and this is. I mean, we're working on trying to keep the doors open. And I think that a lot of our expenses are based on what did electricity cost last year. And I really enjoyed this presentation because I can see how we can grow into something much bigger than that. Like, what is our mission and what are we doing, and some of the reporting that could be done. And so I'm excited about it. But I don't see any particular virtue to starting at zero with the basic utilities and stuff.
Yeah, well, so it might not work for every congregation, right? What zero-based budgeting does is throw everything up in the air and allow everything to resettle in a dialogue, right? But if what you're really saying is we're here at bare bones and we're constructing doors open, salaries paid, lights on, building not falling into the ground, then a zero-based budget, probably not your best use of time.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, start with, so it depends. If you are more of that program size congregation, you're dealing with, so yeah, we're gonna still fund our youth director in your youth program perhaps, but like, what are the other things that we want to do? And that's a conversation between rector, youth director, vestry, treasurer. How do you want to build your program this year? If we started from zero, what would you want to do? And if it's just last year adopted, okay, well, that's a conversation. We just bring it in. But if this is your time to dream. What would you like to do differently than you did last year? What are some lessons that you learned from last year? And this is sometimes things we don't give ourselves the opportunity to do in church. And even if it's a micro adjustment, we want to do this one extra thing, and you build that into the budget. Just the dialogue is helpful. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
for your time today.
Any other ideas, questions?
I had a kind of a follow-up question. This goes back to when you were talking about the 3 levels. And I didn't quite in my head understand the difference between foundation and endowment, and that just could be because of the current structure that we have. We don't have an endowment, but we have a foundation that does the 4% draw, but it's kind of split between buildings and ground and outreach. And we have designated funds, but we don't have an endowment. I was trying to make in my head, like, what really do you see the difference between foundation and endowment?
Great. So the kind of endowment you're talking about sounds to me like somebody at some point, or some peoples at some points, designated specific amounts and priorities for those amounts. That's yet a whole nother kind of endowment that is restricted. So somebody might say, I'm giving $1 million to make certain that the choir will live in perpetuity, right? Or I'm giving this much of my estate and I want these 2 priorities to be funded from it. So they've put that restriction into the original gift, which no vestry, only the state attorney can go back and change that, and only under very dire circumstances can a donor's original intention be changed. So I'm dealing with a congregation right now that received an enormous endowment back in the 20s for something called the Waifs and Strays Fund, which was meant to help kids that were unhoused, but in a very particular way. And they almost can't use it because it can't be used. Anyway, there are all these weird restrictions on it, but it was accepted. And now it's just sitting there accumulating money and it can't be spent. It's like the worst generating stewardship ever because it just is money untouchable. So what am I saying in all this? Restricted endowments, they happen. Be careful about them. Also, having a gift acceptance policy that gives the vestry the ability to say, we don't want to accept that restriction. That's
Right.
too much hand tying for us. And being able to go back and say, we'd accept this gift if it didn't have this, or whatever, renegotiate it if
Mhm.
it's possible. But if it's not possible, so you have reserves, you have, which are completely vestry designated. You have funds functioning as endowment, which are also completely vestry designated. It's put into a reserve that you take a fixed percentage from that you agree on. You have an endowment, which is unrestricted and goes for any operating need that the church has. And then there's what's called a restricted endowment. And that's been set up usually as a part of somebody's estate or a very specific request. And that will always have to be honored in the way it is.
Okay.
Great question.
Do you,
Yeah,
do
Becky.
you have some of that in a, I mean, is this, what you just told us is extremely valuable. Is it like in a Cliff's Notes format somewhere on the 10 site or something?
I'll take
Or
a look
where
at
would we
our,
find it?
I'll take a look at our gift acceptance policy that's in our resource library and see how detailed it is about vestry designated gifts. And maybe we need to add a couple sections of sample language to help with that. But in general, yeah, everything I've said is in a gift acceptance policy.
Okay, well, and I was thinking about the various funds and stuff, because there were
Oh,
more than
no,
just
that
3
isn't.
that you just
I
told
would
us.
have to write something up for you on that.
Or, you know, point us to a book or something. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not averse
yeah.
to reading.
Let me do some research and find the best resource to explain that to you.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to do that. Yeah, it's a great question. And it comes up a lot because
Well, and that's part of the mess that we're looking at, because we had somebody who absolutely understood all of this stuff, and then we had that big blow up with one of our pastors, and half the congregation left, and everything kind of went to hell in a handbasket. And so I need, or we need, some of that basic knowledge in order to kind of try to reconstruct what we should have, and we're not sure what we've got. So thank you.
great. I will definitely look at what I have. You should also check in with your diocese, your chancellor or your CFO, your endowment committee or investment committee. I bet they have some ideas.
That would be me, other than the diocese person. So,
Right.
okay.
Okay. Edna asked if we're giving other future works. Yeah, we have more. We have 4 more workshops scheduled already this year, and we'll add more. So go to the tens.org website and look at the webinars and see what our upcoming ones are. I'll also send you a link so that you can get on our newsletter, and I'll put that in the materials that I send out today, and we will promote our upcoming webinars. They're all free, all accessible, and we love having you here. Well, thank you, friends. Thanks for spending your mornings or afternoon. I think most of you are spending your afternoon with me. Thank you for doing it. I really appreciate it. This was really a lovely conversation. You'll be getting an email from me later with all of this information. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.